the moment you look at the first one I saw was London. There was my house on a map with all this Cyrillic writing, and you just go, wow. You know, the wow factor is just unbelievable. If you've not seen them before, you think, my goodness, what is this?
We've got here a huge initiative, a huge state-run initiative to map the planet effectively, and in many ways succeeded to do that at a range of scales and for many thousands of cities.
And we're specifically talking about secret military topographic maps made by the Soviet Union of world cities.
We get a sense of what the priorities of the Soviet Union were while they were making these maps. So they give us a real window on the past, and I think that's something really valuable.
This is a time when the Soviet Union was collapsing. You know, the economy was collapsing, the trade was collapsing, the country collapsed because it wasn't feeding the people, the economy was bust. Yet these maps being produced all that period belie that. This is not, in a way, a country that can't cope. This is a country that's focused its money on this.
There is something really quite exciting about, you know, the idea that these were kind of hidden basically underneath the Soviet Union, underneath the Iron Curtain for so long, or behind the Iron Curtain for so long, that only recently now we're starting to see them.
I think the golden question has always been, why were these maps made? And I think often when people look at the maps, that's often the first question they ask. They go, why did they do all of this? And certainly when you think about the sheer amount of resource and effort it would have taken to produce these maps, there must have obviously been a motivation behind doing that.
And it's a project unlike any other. Nobody else attempted anything like that before or after.
As the Second World War drew to a close, the Soviet Union began a project unlike any other. They created a catalogue of thousands of secret military maps. Their success shows an incredible effort of intelligence gathering, which continued to remain secret until the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Even now, we know surprisingly little about the project, and even less about exactly how it started.
The very earliest Soviet city plans were made right at the end of the Second World War. So around the mid to late 1940s, we see the first large-scale plans of cities starting to emerge from the Soviet Union.
We have this idea that the Soviet Union was going to launch this huge counteroffensive all the way back to Berlin, and so therefore the Soviet Union needed not only topographic maps to support that thrust, if you like, of the Red Army towards Germany, but also to capture Berlin. And to do that, they needed an up-to-date map of the city of Berlin.
There was a particular map of Berlin called the Berlin Victory Map that was made just at the end of the war, which is obviously made for a specific purpose for Soviet military operations in Berlin in 1945.
Былых побед германской армии. Сегодня на нем развивается победное знамя советского оружия. Berlin взят.
That Stalin obviously realised throughout really this turning point in World War II and going forward, immediately in the post-war reconstruction of the Soviet Union, how important maps were actually as a necessary ingredient, let's say, for rebuilding the state.
We see a steady stream of maps being created throughout the rest of the 1940s and through the 1950s as well. And we see maps being produced not only of places within the Soviet Union or places within the kind of sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, but we see maps being produced of places further afield as well. So we start to see a sense of this global spread of the programme.
This is a time when the Soviet Union was collapsing. You know, the economy was collapsing, the trade was collapsing, the country collapsed because it wasn't feeding the people, the economy was bust. Yet these maps being produced all that period belie that. This is not, in a way, a country that can't cope. This is a country that's focused its money on this.
As the project progressed, the Soviet Union continued to produce an increasing number of maps of worldwide cities. The easiest way to get an idea of how unusual these maps are is simply to look at them. With a project as secret as this, the only source of information we really have are the maps themselves.
So this is a Soviet military city plan of Oxford from 1973, and the plan was produced across 2 sheets. The number of sheets that city plans are spread across really varies depending on the size of the city. For smaller towns and cities, we'll see a map on 1 sheet. For some larger cities, places like New York or Los Angeles, we might see 10, 12 sheets. So it really does vary depending on the size of the city. The aesthetic of the plans is fairly similar, regardless of what city we're looking at. We see these very prominent orange streets running through the map. We see green areas for vegetation. We see contours as well. And of course, we see all the water marked in blue. I think one of the striking things when you look at the map is seeing all of the Cyrillic text. So down the side here, you can see a complete listing of streets in the city. So basically street index listed alphabetically in the Cyrillic alphabet. And just like the other place names that are included on the map, the name of every street is transliterated phonetically into the Cyrillic alphabet. So a Russian speaker would be able to look at this street index and say the names of these streets as they would be said locally. Next to the list of streets and the list of important objects, we have the Spravka, which is the descriptive text about the city. So you'll often see to the side of a Soviet city plan this block of text, which is the Spravka, that descriptive text telling you lots of background information about the city and lots of information that supplements the information that's included on the map itself.
Справка. Общее сведение. Оксфорд – город-графство и административный центр графства Оксфордшир в Великобритании, значительный промышленный центр, известный университетский центр и узел дорог, 6 железных и 9 автомобильных. Расположен на реке Темзе 80 километров к северо-западу от Лондона. В 1969 году в Оксфорде насчитывалось 109 тысяч жителей. Площадь города около 35 квадратных километров.
Many of them, not only is it a cartographic delight, but they're accompanied with a comprehensive essay, typically 2,000 or 3,000 words, descriptive essay of the locality, of the buildings, of the economy, of the population, the weather, the climate, all sorts of information. And those are fascinating. And so that's, in a way, separate from the cartographic enterprise, is this enterprise of collecting and collating and writing these descriptive essays.
Наиболее важными военно-промышленными объектами являются автомобильные заводы. Объект 1-2. Работает чугунно-литейный завод, объект 9, а также ряд предприятий полиграфической, бумажной, легкой и пищевой промышленности.
The other angle that fascinates me is how the cartographers have interpreted the information that has been collected. They've been brought up within the Soviet Union. They've got a kind of worldview that's within the context of the Soviet Union. So things come up on these maps that how do they understand what this is? How do they interpret something which is a completely different culture? And they make a bloody good job of it. You're amazed quite often how well represented things are.
The other thing that I think really stands out about this series of maps is the coverage that the Soviet Union included across the world. as far as we know, around about 2,000 cities, or over 2,000 cities, were included in the city plan series, which is a phenomenal undertaking, really.
This is a global coverage at large scale. The quality of them, the quality of the printing, like 12 colour printing, very, very high quality printing on good paper, the quality of the data, and so of the whole production.
You get this other layer of information about strategic objects, so things like, for example, the military industrial objects or buildings, the administrative buildings and the military buildings, and how these are all colour-coded and then numbered, so that it would mean that someone could look at these and then understand what was important or not within that city, and that sort of thing from a kind of military strategy perspective you wouldn't get on a normal survey map. And I think when you start to look at that and see the difference in the Soviet mapping, then you're really starting to reveal something of the mindset behind the people that produced it and how that's different from perhaps, you know, how we would approach our own mapping.
Even if we compare the maps with something like Ordnance Survey maps of the UK, things like military installations on many Ordnance Survey maps aren't included in any great detail. Whereas on the Soviet maps, we can see all of the little details there of roads, buildings, and other kind of installations within those facilities. So it's not a case of the Soviet Union was simply just copying existing maps that existed. It's likely that they used existing maps, obviously, but then they've gone much further than that. So we end up with a product that's much more detailed than certainly any kind of commercially available mapping from the time.
And the maps never look cluttered. They never look over busy. They've just managed to portray things in that you can readily pick it up, you can readily understand, and you can use it for action, which is the point of a mapping, the point of these maps in a way. And that's hugely impressive.
These Soviet maps were leagues ahead of anything produced by the other superpowers, not just in their world coverage, but also in the sheer level of information they include.
I mean, if we look at these maps, the level of information they include is really, really quite high. When we look at any map of a city, we'd expect to see roads, we'd expect to see streets, and of course those things are there when we look at the Soviet maps. But we're also seeing much more information beyond that as well. We're seeing information about the physical environment, for example. We're seeing things like geology, relief. We're seeing bathymetric information about bodies of water. We're seeing information about industry. It just keeps going on and on with all of this extra information that's really kind of above and beyond what we'd normally expect to see when we're looking at a map of a city.
But that's the kind of thing they have. I mean, these forests are just one of my lovely examples. You look at a forest. They don't do this on the British maps because they couldn't get the information. But if you could get the information, so that in a map, say, of Lithuania, for example, they've got a forest, and then it'll say these are coniferous trees, or these are deciduous trees, and they are acer, oak. You know, they'll show what species of tree. They'll show the average height, girth, and distance apart of the trees. So much information. Who's ever want to know this? And it's going to change. So they'll revise it. And then, similarly with the rivers, here's a river, it's got a sandy bed, it's flowing at a certain speed, its depth at the sides is this, and its depth in the middle is that, and the current's that way, it's tidal up to that. Massive amounts of information. I can only admire it. Wow.
Yeah, I think one of the key types of sort of detail are things like the with vegetation, a species of tree, for example, how far apart the trees are, their girth, spacing, that sort of thing. Huge amounts of detail that really, I think, would have been supported, if not gained or gathered, from people being there in the field to be able to go there and get that information. As you go further away from the Soviet Union and the Soviet states and the satellite states, or Warsaw Pact countries, then that information starts to tail off. So there is, in a sense, a very real decay effect when we look at the level of information. It's clear that if you were a country or a territory within the Soviet Union, let's say the Baltic states, for example, where there was virtually literally no limit on access, then effectively a heck of a lot of information was obtained. So there you've got the full range of data.
So that's the first thing. Secondly, they devised a system of symbols or notation and annotation whereby they could portray information from across the world, all the many different building types, the many different types of terrain, the many different types of, agriculture, of industry. They had devised a complex, comprehensive list of symbols or annotations, abbreviations to use, such that they can show great detail, a map of anywhere you like, and a trained person, it doesn't take a lot of training, it's quite easy to do, you can easily understand everything that's on there, you can see what it all is.
Really, the symbology is kind of the vocabulary, I suppose is the right word, that you use to describe features on a map. So you might have a more extensive vocabulary of symbols for showing that particular type of feature. And the funny thing about the Soviet maps is that they've got a huge range of symbols. So there's a massive number of symbols and a bigger vocabulary that they use, if you see what I mean, for describing different features that you see.
You're amazed quite often how well represented things are, and you think, well, there must be... One example of that is place names. Place names throughout the world, but we can look at them as place names in English and in Irish language, Welsh language. Place names are always represented phonetically. So you had to know how to say this. We have some trick names in English, like the Leicesters and the Gloucesters and so on. But even quite unusual or unfamiliar ones. There's a small village or small town in Norfolk called Wyndham, but it's spelt Wymondham. But it's shown as Wyndham on the map. Somebody knew. Somebody found out that's how you say it and put it on the map. How did they do that? It's representative of the amount of effort that's been put in to get these maps, to convey as much as information as possibly could, put it on the map. Anything you could find out, put it on the map. You never know when it might be useful. So that's what they've done. As I say, and the thing is a visual delight when they've done it.
But the question remains, how was this achieved? The details included must have come from somewhere, especially at a time when many of the countries being mapped were so suspicious of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, everybody said the question is, how did they do this? Where's the information come from? And of course, in trying to answer that question, you would look for evidence. You would look at like a reverse detective story. You would look at a map and find some evidence of where this information might have come from.
I think from looking at the maps, we get a sense that really the cartographers were using whatever information they could get hold of, really, in order to learn about the city that they were mapping and include that information on the map. Some of the earlier city plans include, at the bottom of the map, a list of some of the maps that were used in the compilation of that map. So that will tell you, say, the date and the scale of a map that was used to help in the compilation of the Soviet map.
You've got this whole idea, again, from the victory map method, if you like, of collating as much information as you could, whether it be aerial photographs, eventually satellite imagery, books, guidebooks, other maps, of course, anything that could be used to produce these maps.
Because they didn't just collect Ordnance Survey maps. Of course they did collect Ordnance Survey maps, but a Russian assumption would be, at that time, if a map is in the public domain, it's falsified, because you didn't make accurate maps available to the public. That's dangerous, you don't do that. So they wouldn't trust the Ordnance Survey map to be accurate. So they would have lots of other... And of course, Ordnance Survey maps only show a small fraction of what they're trying to show. They're trying to show industries, they're trying to show different land cover, they're trying to show differentiate, for example, between an electric railway and a non-electric railway, or between a tube station and a rail station. Ordnance Survey maps don't tell you that. So they collected far more. They collected directories, they collected street atlases, tourist guidebooks.
Certainly in terms of the earlier maps, we see a much heavier dependence on that existing mapping, obviously because satellite imagery wasn't available. Once satellite imagery does become available, those lists of source materials start to drop off from the map. We see those less as we move into the satellite era.
Satellite mapping really started in about 1962-63 with the Zenit program of satellites. So this was a program that was specifically launched to create imagery and therefore mapping from space.
As soon as the first satellites were launched that were producing imagery suitable for creating maps, you see a dramatic increase in the number of maps being produced.
Now, this is where we see a huge explosion in, certainly on the Soviet side, a huge explosion in the number of satellites being launched that had mapping capability or reconnaissance capability, and specifically the ability to take stereographic images that could then be returned to Earth in film capsules, typically, that could then be turned into maps.
I think the advent of satellite imagery changed the way that the maps were produced quite considerably. I think the starting point before that had been an existing map of a city, which was enlarged or reduced to the scale that the new map was going to be, and then extra information was added to it. After satellite imagery became available, it was a satellite image that became the kind of base map that was used as the starting point for creating the map. And then other information from other sources was added onto that, including information from existing maps.
So you get all of this background information they've collected, and to try and, so it's mind-boggling how much stuff has been acquired. Who acquired this stuff? Where did they get it from? How did they get it to Moscow? Where, these are unknown. We can speculate. We don't know.
So, for example, things like the materials in a riverbed, the width, carrying capacity of bridges, their heights above water, and again, anything really that factories produced. But again, that's an example, the carrying capacity of bridges, because these are sort of indicators, of little annotations on the map that will say something like 100 tons is the limit and that sort of thing. And again, a lot of that really you'd only want to put on the map if you were sure it was true or accurate. And the only really certain way to be sure of that would be to send someone there so that they could physically be there and assess whether the bridge had that sort of level of carrying capacity, or at the very least get hold of some documentation that would be otherwise quite hard to get hold of, that then would have that sort of information.
So I'm absolutely intrigued by the process of collecting and collating all this background information, whatever it was, directories and all these things, or whether it was personal observation. Did people come here, wander around taking notes? Yes, they must have done. Finding hard evidence of that is really hard. Is there anything on the map that must have come from somebody on the ground? Or could it have come from elsewhere? And those are the questions we've been trying to answer. And always, to some extent you can answer the questions. To some extent you'll never know.
The amount of manpower and energy involved in the project shows just how important it must have been to the leaders of the Soviet Union. Yet it's difficult to be exactly sure of the motivation behind it.
I think the golden question has always been, why were these maps made? And I think often when people look at the maps, that's often the first question they ask. They go, why did they do all of this? And certainly when you think about the sheer amount of resource and effort it would have taken to produce these maps, there must have obviously been a motivation behind doing that.
So I think that question of why these maps were made is a really fundamental one, and it's one any time that I, or John certainly, or Martin does a talk on any of the Soviet mapping, that key question of why they were made is always there. And the sort of go-to knee-jerk reaction is, well, these are invasion plans. They're designed to be used for invasion and so on. And that view has, I suppose, some credibility, because you could look back at, let's say, the victory map, the map of Berlin that was produced specifically for that idea, to kind of give the invading troops into Berlin an idea of what to expect for planning urban operations, this sort of thing, to conduct their combat on the ground. So we have an idea of the maps very much being practical documents. However, if we take a step back a little bit from that and you look at these maps, you sort of get the sense that really they're not that useful for invasion purposes. And it's almost as if they are used, certainly the city plans, it's almost like they're more useful for post-invasion purposes, for knowing how to run a city rather than how to invade it.
What they are is like collecting as much information as we possibly can about this place, because, this is my assumption, because one day we're going to be in charge, and this is what you need to know. This is what you need to know to run the city. There's the bus station, there's the railway stations, there's where the power, there's where the industry is, and the highways. So those kind of things, they are of military significance in the sense that once you're running that city, that's the information you need to command and control, as you might call it.
So they wouldn't necessarily have the types of information that you would want if you were going to invade. So they wouldn't have specific information about, for example, the particular streets you would go down, or the defences that would be there that would need to be overcome. These might be produced as annotations, of course, but there's a sense, really, overriding everything, that these maps follow the kind of tradition of military cartography, where if something could be important, then it was deemed to be important enough to put on a map. And a really good example of this, and this is for both the topographic maps and for the city plans, is outdated infrastructure and transportation, like, for example, tramways, old railways that even disused mines, that sort of thing. Because you get this sense that basically once maybe a railway had been cut, an embankment had been made, or a railway cutting had been made, and a railway had been laid, perhaps maybe it could be reused. There was this idea perhaps that there was value in actually mapping these things because they could be reused. And even the map of Dover, funny enough, the Soviet plan of Dover has got the aerial cableway that used to take coal from the coal mines in Tilmanstone. Even though all of this stopped way before the Soviet plan of Dover, I don't know if it continued even until the 1950s, but the Soviet plan of Dover is 1974, and it still shows this coal aerial cableway as a potential. Well, it still shows it there on the map as if it was there in use. So again, this idea of where there was utility and something that was important that could still potentially be used, then it also appears on the map. So this whole idea of, again, knowledge, and where there is evidence for something, that goes on the map, even though it might be obsolete. And again, there are so many maps that have got obsolete tramways and that sort of thing. It's very, very curious. You see a lot of the city centres that have got these lines, and they are for tramways that might have closed 60, 70 or 80 years beforehand. But actually there's this sense maybe that these maps are suggesting what might be possible in terms of reopening them, rather than maybe just thinking of these maps as purely invasion maps and so on.
Obviously, at the time the maps were made during the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about invasion or use of atomic weapons. You could ask, if you plan to completely destroy a place, why would you bother mapping it in huge amount of detail like that? So that's probably something to consider as well.
And that's what's intriguing about the Russian. What was the purpose? Why did you need to know all of that? And it can only be that this will be useful because communism will prevail. Of course it will. And when it does. Again, there must also be a kind of assumption that there wasn't going to be a nuclear holocaust. Because, again, my generation grew up assuming that we're all going to get blown to blazes, and there's no point in bothering anyway, because the place is going to be flattened. Well, if you have that assumption that the place is going to be flattened, what's the point of trying all the little back streets on the map and all the bus stops? There's no point. So, and of course the map cartographers don't necessarily need to be privy to what do we think is the strategic purpose of this. You're just told, here's a load of information, put it on a piece of paper. But somebody somewhere must be, and some large amounts of funding must be allocated to producing these on an ongoing basis from the 1940s, 1950s, right into the 1990s or 2000s. We don't know when it stopped, and it may not have.
So it would be great if I could sit here and tell you why these maps were made, but the honest answer is we really don't know definitively for sure why these maps were made. I think a lot of research on these maps has really just had to go on the maps themselves. We don't really have too much access to the records of when these maps were produced, certainly information from the factories where these maps were made. We don't have a great amount of that information. So a lot of the work that's been done has been, as I say, using the maps themselves to try and understand more.
The main reason for this lack of information is the intense secrecy the maps are under, even now. These are objects that were never meant to be seen outside of the Soviet military.
So the military maps that we're particularly discussing they're secret, which means that nobody has access to them other than absolutely authorised users, which would be Soviet officers. Soviet soldiers would not be trained to use them anyway. They wouldn't understand the symbology, so officers would, but they would be entitled to use these maps. And the anecdotal story we have from my colleague, my friend in Riga, was that if you were using one of these maps out on an exercise or whatever, you had to sign the map out in the morning, and you had to return the map the same, when you returned the map, you had to sign it back in. And if somehow it got damaged or destroyed or something, then you're going to be in quite serious trouble. You know, this map is in itself, this physical map is secret, it's important, and it has to be protected. And that was made, it's a very, very severe rule.
I think that's one of the amazing things about these maps, is that despite the fact that such a vast quantity of them were produced, at the time, outside the Soviet military, no one knew anything about them at all, really. They were obviously classified secret, so even within the Soviet Union, these maps weren't known about. The members of the public wouldn't have had a clue that these maps were being produced at the time.
They're secret because they're accurate. They're absolutely accurate, as accurate as they could possibly make them, and contain massive amount of strategic information. So why did it matter? It matters because if you've got an accurate map, and that's geographically accurate, then it can be used for targeting. It can be used by anybody with ill intent, let's say, to target things.
They are, or were, produced under highly controlled secret circumstances and bear a very high degree of secrecy as well, and marked secret, for example, and there would be very serious circumstances if they went missing. It is curious to see how, again, there's quite ironic really that you've got this complete switch in terms of the life that the maps were intended to have and the one that they now have.
These maps remain highly secret documents, and it's strange that we have them at all. So how did the maps find their way out of the Soviet Union and into a part of the world they had been silently at war with for half a century?
So it was really something of a surprise after the Soviet Union dissolved when these maps emerged for the first time, and really took the world by surprise because no one knew that they had been produced. When the Soviet Union was dissolved, a lot of the factories that had been producing these maps and a lot of the depots where these maps had been stored closed down, they were abandoned, and were really just getting rid of a lot of the contents that were left over in those buildings. And it was actually a map shop in Latvia discovered that this was happening at one of the map depots near to them in Riga in Latvia. And they managed to get hold of some of the maps that were being discarded after the Soviet Union had been dissolved. And they started to sell those maps from their map shop in Riga, and it's something that they've continued to do ever since then.
Latvia is really important in this story, and there's several reasons for that. Clearly Latvia was part of the Soviet Union during Soviet times. It's where many of these maps surfaced after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's where my personal history is I happened to be working in Latvia in the early 2000s and found them in a shop, the map shop in the centre of Riga. And I got very interested, got very friendly with the people in the shop. Turns out they had been, the guy who started the shop and the sales manager that I was getting friendly with had been officers in the Russian army, so they knew quite a lot about the background. And they had this amazing supply of the Russian maps. They had a big collection of these because these maps had been created during the Cold War, during the period from the 70s, 80s, so on. Throughout, they've been printed and compiled in different cities across the Soviet Union, but they've been stored in depots, probably 20 or 30 different depots, all across the Soviet Union, so that local officers could be sent, collect some maps, you're off on a mission tomorrow kind of thing. And one of these depots had been in a town called Secrecy, which is in eastern Latvia. And that, because of the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union, the sudden independence of Latvia, this depot with its thousands and thousands, literally tons and tons of maps, had been left stranded.
The story goes, I think, that those maps then, there was some sort of deal where they couldn't be described as maps, they could only be described as waste paper. So I think the orienteer said something like, well, you know, I'll take all this waste paper off your hands. And they agreed, after perhaps bribing the guards, and then, you know, these tons of maps were available. And then there was a fire, I think, and some of them got lost. But effectively, that body of maps, that depository, if you like, is still very much, I suppose, existing in terms of the stock that Janaceta still have today, which is the map shop and the map publishing company that this orienteer was associated with or owned.
And there are various stories about how it happens, some quite comical stories about how it happened, but eventually it did happen that this map shop in Riga acquired this huge collection of maps. They say they acquired them as waste paper because they weren't allowed to have the maps. Of course, they were secret, but the Russians who were trying to get rid of them didn't want to transport them back to Moscow. So the shop got them and was selling them for about £1 a piece or something like that. So every time I went into the shop, I would get another armful of these maps.
I think the maps first came to the attention of the rest of the world in 1993 at the International Cartographic Conference in Cologne, when this map shop in Latvia started distributing flyers about these maps at the conference, and really took the people there by surprise. Obviously, we had a big gathering there of cartographers from around the world, none of whom knew anything about these maps. So it was really a huge surprise when they emerged for the first time.
I don't think these gained any attention, virtually any attention at all, at that time. It was only really when John and I started to realise this basically a decade later, that effectively there was something really quite exciting here that needed to be written about. And the military, I think, realised this and realised that these were important assets and so on. But I think it was only really then when John and I looked at these about a decade later and started to research them in detail that we started to get into and discover the fact that these were really quite unique, and particularly that this former depot in Latvia was really a very, very significant site.
I think since 1991, the maps have spread really quite widely around the world. Since they became commercially available for people to buy, they've made their way into private collections, they've made their way into hundreds of different libraries around the world. Obviously, a lot of different places have a particular interest in their local area and the maps that were produced there. But the maps have now found themselves all over the world in various collections.
Although these maps were made in the 20th century, they still hold a great value for us in the 21st, both historically and practically.
The maps give us a real window on the past. They tell us about some of the things that were going on in the Cold War. They tell us what the world was like at that time. And in terms of what's included in the maps and what's been left off the maps, we get a sense of what the priorities of the Soviet Union were while they were making these maps. So they give us a real window on the past, and I think that's something really valuable about the maps. We can learn so much about history from looking at them.
It's easy to look at these maps, I think, as historical documents, and indeed they are really, really valuable for that. I've already mentioned about, for example, they reveal a lot about Britain's industrial heritage, that sort of thing, and again, transportation that's been disused. So there's a lot of urban history that can come out of these maps, I think, particularly in city plans.
At that time, we had the two superpowers. And, you know, we knew America had we knew what America was up to, and it was developing the nuclear weapons and all. We know that. Russia just seemed like a massive enemy over there. We knew nothing about it except that they were very dangerous. So this gives us some perspective of slightly more nuanced anyway, but if nothing else. You know, they were collecting a huge amount of information that we were not collecting that information, well, at least as far as we knew we weren't.
Away from the kind of historical element, I think what's important to recognise is that for a lot of areas around the world, particularly in Central Asia, these maps offer the most detailed representation of terrain that we have.
In some parts of the world, the Soviet maps are still some of the best information we have about some cities and about some countries around the world. So in those parts of the world, supplementing the Soviet maps with more modern satellite imagery, for example, can produce a really valuable resource for learning about the current geography of these places. So I think the maps still definitely have a big role to play.
There's a demand for the maps, at least, I think, from a kind of a design aspect, you know, from a commercial angle, where it's not really to do with the history of the mapping, but these are curious and beautiful and interesting and fascinating objects. So again, you know, reprints of maps like this was part of New York here, you know, that sort of thing people are interested in, I think, because they have this level of detail. There's an element of history with them, but you know, they are striking and they have their own appeal. I think that's very true.
Yeah, well, it's the visuals. I mean, that is, you just look at one of these and they've been used in art galleries. There was Southampton did a lovely display of the maps, just really as objects of beauty. You didn't need to look at it and understand anything about it. You just need to admire the colouring. So they've emerged. Oh, they're still not all that widely known. I mean, I won't say they've emerged into the world that people are admiring them, but where people encounter them. And it's like, the book continues to sell just because people are fascinated and intrigued and have no idea.
But the maps have another presence in the modern day, one which is becoming increasingly hard to ignore. Because of the secrecy around these maps, we have no way of knowing whether or not the project is still going on.
We know that, for example, after the latest maps that we've seen produced during the Cold War, so really right until the end of 1991, for example, but you also know of a couple that have been produced after that. So, and again, these have become available openly on the internet. And you can see, as these examples, I think Falmouth in the UK and Cornwall, and a really deep natural harbour, so that's one of these city plans. And also Vancouver in Canada, I think that's from 2003. There's a city plan of that as well. So that indicates that there is some continuity of this project. Obviously, the fact that there's only those two that we know of compared to the 2,000 or so before suggests maybe a couple of things. One, that again they have an ongoing security or secrecy that means they're very difficult to get hold of, and who knows how these other maps sort of were released, let's say. But I think it also says that there is something about the ongoing nature of this project.
You see, that Ukraine is the big question, isn't it? If they were being used in earnest, then there would be evidence of them in Ukraine. And we don't really know what's going on, but as far as I can discover, people have discovered hordes of maps that have been abandoned by Russian soldiers who've retreated and so on. And when you look at these, well, that's exactly like the ones I've got. You know, nothing's changed. So they're not new. The maps they're using in Ukraine, or some of them there might be all kinds of other stuff, who knows. And in a way, also bear in mind that paper mapping is really redundant in this world of electronic, who knows what. They must have, they must have Google Maps and nothing else, you know.
Well, the funny thing is that on social media, what we see at the moment, there's a lot of images of the maps that the Russians have been using, but apparently, from what I've seen so far, they tend to be these old Soviet topographic maps from the 1980s, rather than anything more recent than that. So that, in a way, is a little bit of I suppose, a bit of a contradiction. You've got a country that has been mapping for hundreds of years, and specifically probably had the most comprehensive cartographic project of the 20th century, and yet when it came to the 21st century and they actually wanted to put this into practice, perhaps, and use these maps for, you know, their sort of chilling intended purpose, maybe, that actually what we see emerging is the reliance of the army, of those needing to use that information on maps that were, 40 years or so out of date, at least. So that in itself is a really curious thing.
We're never at the end of the story, but and as Ukraine has shown us, because we all thought we were beyond the days of people barging into their neighbour's country, but we're not beyond those days. But the maps have and the maps are part of that story, because the maps have got the information you need to do that invasion, and they did it.
The Soviet Union's mapping project remains the most extensive ever conducted. It gives us a great insight into the priorities and politics of one of the most powerful nations of the 20th century. But we still know almost nothing about the story behind these maps. It continues to fade into the past, overshadowed by the other aspects of the Cold War.
We've got here a huge initiative, a huge state-run initiative to map the planet, effectively, and in many ways succeeded to do that at a range of scales, and for many thousands of cities, at least 2,000 cities around the world, of a global diversity of environments that is notoriously difficult as a challenge for cartographers, particularly at different scales.
When you consider the amount of cities that were included in this series, it's really quite an immense undertaking that was done to produce these maps.
And it's a project unlike any other. Nobody else attempted anything like that before or after. And I suppose it's absolutely of its time. Google came along, there's world maps, there's world satellite coverage available to anybody and everybody. So the whole thing's redundant in that sense. But the soft information isn't there. You can't look at a Google map and find out how fast does a stream flow, or what's the species of the tree.
I think also the fact that very little is known about these maps. Although there have been some studies into the maps, there's been very little kind of systematic research. Certainly until quite recently in the academic community, the maps have been the subject of very little systematic work. Only really in the last few years has that started to change.
Here we've got a state that was mapping the rest of the world to a standard specification. And that presents a huge challenge and a huge resource in terms of how intellectually and cartographically they addressed and overcame that challenge of mapping this diversity of global environments. And not only that, but how they approached mapping these different environments with their diversities and their cultural diversity as well, in ways that could be understood by others, by the Soviet military as the user.
And the whole thing about technology is also extremely interesting and important. Computers were not in this at all. These are entirely hand-drawn, hand-created. We tried to track the cartographers and the editors. A lot of the earlier maps name the cartographers and name the editor, and you can track them. You can see that particularly the editors would work across a whole range of different types of maps anywhere in the world over quite long periods of time. So they were obviously very good at their jobs. I think, oh gosh, if you could just talk to one of these guys and find out how they were doing this. Well, I would deeply love to know more about the process.
There's a huge amount of research that can still be done into these maps. I mean, some of the work that I've done has really only focused on a small group of the maps, say maybe around about 20 or so that I've really studied in minute detail. But there are over 2,000 of these maps, so there's much more to learn in terms of how different places around the world were mapped, how these different cities compare with one another in terms of the information that's included on the maps.
We did go and give a talk about these in the Lenin Library. Was it 2011, I think? And it was long before the book was published, but we were deep into our researches, and we realised that we knew practically nothing, but we found these maps, we were intrigued by them, we'd done a lot of this kind of research or detective work, reverse detective work. So we thought, well, we were invited to this cartographic conference, and it was all in English, and we were invited to go anyway. So we thought, well, we'll just go and say, look, we know nothing about these, but throw the thing open. Not a soul. We didn't get a peep out of anybody. So you thought, yeah, well, you're not going to, because people... And of course, if you look the other way around, if there were people here who'd been working on secret projects during the Cold War, they're not going to tell passing Russians what was going on. Why would they? So you're not going to get this information. And in a way, that just makes it intriguing, and it opens the door to us to be able to speculate, honestly speculate. We're not pretending otherwise. We're saying, these are the kind of assumptions we would make. As I always say, there's more questions than answers. All you can do is look at this and think about it, and kind of speculate.